Hi, I'm fauxtoprotraveller. Welcome back to the channel, and today I'm going to give you my top 5 Lightroom 2020 tips. Today I'm actually going to edit the shots in front of you to show you what I mean, to help you get along the way with your photo editing. Now, Lightroom shouldn't be a program that is altogether that scary, but I know from experience that coming into photography editing, if you're shooting in RAW and you get Lightroom, you look at the panels and there's a lot of information. And whilst it might seem relatively easy to move the sliders one way or the other and get instant results, the question is, what is it you're trying to get out of an image? What can Lightroom do to make that a reality? Now, Lightroom is an incredibly powerful resource, but it's one you really need to spend time with. You need to listen to the tips of experienced people like I did when I was starting out. So this is my attempt to try and give something back and to see if I can give you a couple of pointers along the way to help you accelerate in your journey towards Lightroom excellence. So in this video, I'm going to give you 5 top tips on how to use Lightroom together with one golden rule. The first question is, what is it that makes a good photo? Well, by the time you get into Lightroom, the composition, the image, the lighting, most of that is pretty well set. The story that you're trying to tell with your image, all the pieces of the puzzle are there. And what you're trying to do in Lightroom really is take those pieces and enhance them. Ensure that the person who is viewing your image gets exactly what you want them to get out of the image. Now, that could mean removing distracting elements. It could mean changing the tone to develop a feel. It could be altering colors so that particular elements stand out or stand into the background. And that's what Lightroom is about, to ensure that the story that you want your audience to see is there in the image so they don't miss it. So with that being said, the first golden rule that I'm going to point out to you today is that you need to understand what is it that you want your image to portray to your audience. What mood do you want to be conveyed? What is it that struck you when you composed the image that you wanted to be able to get across to your audience? Knowing that in advance makes the whole editing process significantly easier because you'll know in a general sense what it is that you want to convey. And a couple of examples of that might be, if it's a cold winter day, you'll hardly want to bolster the colors and make it bright and sunny or warm the tones up. You want to do exactly the opposite. Or if it's a portrait, if you're showing a weathered face, maybe extra clarity and bringing out contrast might really help to tell the story of a battered, weary traveller, for example. So that's what we're going to get into later on when we get into Lightroom. So that's the first golden tip for you today, is to understand before you get into the program what it is you want to say with your image. I've got a number of images ready to go to show you my tips, and while we do that, let's play the intro. Okay, so now on to the first tip, and that is to play with the color dials. Now, most people would tell you that the very first thing you should do is get your exposure right. But my theory is that if your exposure is pretty well there, then actually it's really important as part of your visual storytelling to get the colors right. And then you can obviously come back and play with exposure to help bolster that out. Now, to show you what I mean by that, let's go to these first 2 images. So this first one here is of one of my favorite places in the world to photograph, and that's Venice in Italy. Now we'll come back here into the light panel, but I want to go straight into the color panel. Now, why am I doing that? Well, the story I want to tell with this particular image is of a gloomy, old, weathered city, which is what Venice is, in fact, and this was taken in December, so quite a cold part of the year. So to do that, well, the first trick, I suppose, the first thing you can do if you want to show dreary, cold weather is to drop down the saturation. But dropping that saturation will give, and of course if you keep going, you're just going to keep taking color out of the image and it's going to make it seem old. Even more than that, if you want to show cold, then clearly the temperature is something you can have a look at here in color temperature. Just dropping it to the left is going to bring out the blues. Now, I probably wouldn't do that ordinarily with this image, so I'll reset that and I'll come down here into color grading. And that's really what's going to get us that mood of a colder image. And then, as I said, we'll go back into the light panel and we'll adjust those contrast, highlights and shadows. And you'll see why I do it this way. A lot of people would do it the opposite way, but I figure that if you've got the exposure right, you pretty well can get the mood and then edit the light around that mood. So firstly, let's have a look. There's quite a lot of shadows in this image. So we'll go to shadows and we'll just bring the slider down into the blues. Now, with the way that Lightroom 2020 works now, you can, if you move this dial around, you're going to get different colors. So you can see, if I just make this a bit more obvious to see, as I bring the dials around, you watch the image changing colors from reds to greens to yellows and back to blue. So I want it cold, so I want it to be in that sort of blue zone. I certainly don't want that much. But if you get to just a little bit, and then over here, you can play with the amount of blending between the mids, the highlights, and the shadows. We'll leave that right at the moment. Okay, so if we come over here into the highlights panel now, we want to go with something more towards the oranges. And as I said, this is going to give you the hue. And over here, you can also play with this slider, which is going to give you the luminance. So if we just bring that back a touch, but I think with the shadows, we might bring that. And into the mids, I think we'll also want to go up here into the oranges. You can already see with what we've done here, that if we go back to the original, and that yellowy tone, and we haven't played with the light as yet, but with that yellowy tone that's coming out through the buildings, you'll see that we've already, I think, given it a slightly older feel. So now we've done that, you can come up here into the lights, this is how I would normally do it, into the light panel, and start playing with your exposure, your contrast, and try to maybe bring out some sky. But already you can see, if we go back to the original, it's more colorful. This is muted, and if I had edited this simply for light, you would have got a better exposed image, but you wouldn't necessarily have that age, which if we go to the current edit, that yellowy feel, that green that's coming out is showing, I think, in my view, a more rounded image of the story that I'm trying to tell, which is, this is old Venice. This could be 1950s or even earlier, walking through the old canal streets. That's what Venice gives me as an emotion, which I'm trying to get out. If I had bumped the colors up on this image and really made it, a typical snapped on my phone, bump up the saturation, mind you, keeping the color mix as I've amended it, even then with that additional color, it's not giving me that same old feel. I much prefer, my style is the muted editing. Now I'll take you across to a second image, which I've got down the bottom here. And this is to show you again the power of the color sliders and why I think you should go there first. Now this one is actually quite well exposed, better exposed I think than the last image. And you can see that what's really important if you're taking photos of people is skin tone. Now, it's the first thing people notice. Even though at first glance you might say, well, that seems quite well exposed, the first thing I'm going to do here is adjust the temperature. Now, you can use the little eyedropper here, and I'd recommend as a starting point you do that. And what you want to find is a nice white or a neutral color. I actually, as a bit of a trick, if there were teeth showing in this image, that were well exposed, I click on teeth because you try to tell the camera that's about white, or the whites of the eyes is another trick. But let's just pick. Now you see I've chosen the eye there, and I think it's given us way too much blue, but it's given us a view that if we had started, that's where we started, if we just drop that color, the temperature down. Now what we've really done here is we have, and if we go back to the original image, now you notice the amount of yellow or orange that's in that image, which can show completely unnatural skin tones. So this is what we now have, which may be even a little too much. The other thing that's done by doing that, it's affected the reds. So now I find in looking at this image that the reds are quite distracting. So I'll come down here to the color mixer this time, and I'll select the target, and I might just grab it onto the red. Now I've got luminance, select saturation, find the red you want, and you can just drag that slider down, and it's going to take some reds out of the image. So now that we've got a temperature that makes more sense than what is quite clearly, now you see the original quite yellow, we can go back up into the light panel and start giving the image a bit more of something. As I said, it's reasonably well exposed, but that's why I think it's really important to start with color, whether it's mood for an old image and getting the old feel right, or whether it's a portrait, you just want to have more natural or more clean colors with skin tones. Starting there and then moving on to your other panels, I think is my first tip of the day, getting the color right. Okay, so now on to tip number 2, which is avoiding flat images. Now, assuming you are shooting in RAW, the image that may come out of your camera is likely going to be fairly flat, or potentially could be fairly flat, even if it looks okay in your LCD screen or on your computer as you bring it straight into Lightroom. I would say one of the things that distinguishes professional looking images from images that you can snap with a phone or even with an SLR or mirrorless camera is the ability to have them jump off the page. And that is, when I say avoiding flat images, that's what I'm really talking about. Giving your image some depth, some life, and I'm going to show you a couple of sliders here right now that'll help you do just that. So let's jump back into Lightroom and pick up this image, which I used for another video a couple of days ago. This was shot with the Nikon 14-30 f4. Now, straight off the bat, it's not a bad looking image, but what I want to really highlight, the reason why I selected this image, is the sky. The sky is quite interesting. Now, so the exposure is reasonably okay. We might give it a bit of shadows, but we're going to focus on 2 sliders, and that is contrast and dehaze, which largely do similar things in this context. So let's go over to the contrast slider, and you have a look what happens as I bring it up. If I bring it to the left, the image is flat and dead. If I bring it to the right, all of a sudden we're starting to see some depth into the image. And if I bring the highlights down, and even bring the exposure down a touch, you're seeing now a lot more is happening over here in the sky. You might even bring the whites down. You've got to be careful not to underexpose the image as we're doing this, but you'll see we're getting a lot more going on here. Another way you could add contrast is the classic S-bend in the tone curve. Personally, I'm not a fan of the S-bend, and the reason for that is if you're adjusting contrast, if you have a look up here in the histogram, you're getting a lot of movement across all of the different colors and tones. If you come across to the tone curve, if you adjust just the shadows, you're getting a different movement. You're only really getting a downward movement in the shadows. If you come up in the highlights, you're getting the same, a movement in the highlights, so stretching the image. And I find that adjusting the tone curve is a bit like a blunt object. I much prefer to use, I'm going to undo that, I much prefer to use the contrast slider coupled with, if we come down here to effects, the dehaze slider. Now dehaze, if you've got a hazy image, like there might be cloud cover, there might be fog, and it's an amazingly powerful tool. But you have a look what happens as I bring the slider to the right, you have a look at how the clouds start popping out of the screen. Now you don't want to go too far, you want to create crazy images, or maybe you do, but just those 2 sliders will give you much more of a story. So the story of this image, let's say, is there is a huge storm about to come through. So I want to tell that story. I'm not particularly worried about the fact that that may not have looked exactly how it looked when I took the image. After all, we're storytellers. You get to maybe have a bit of creative control as you make your edits. But one thing I would note is once you've done that, you can get colors that look a bit fake, a bit not realistic. So you do need to come back and maybe have another look in the color. I generally tend to, if I'm bolstering contrast and dehazing, I like to come back and maybe desaturate a little, just to give it a bit more of a realistic feel, and then even coming back into the light panel and adjusting the exposure a little more, just to give it a more realistic feel. The first image wasn't terrible, but hopefully you'll see now what I'm talking about, having an image that pops off the page. That's before the edits, this is with the edits, and you can see this now is telling that story of the gloomy cloud cover coming in, and I think you'll agree, hopefully you'll agree, that the second is more of a visually stunning image, even if it's not the greatest image that ever been taken, but certainly more stunning than the first. So tip number 2 is avoid those flat images. Now, before we get to the last 3 tips, if you haven't subscribed to my channel already, please do so. Hit that bell to get notified when I upload videos, and of course, let me know in the comments down below what you think of these edits. So moving now on to tip number 3, which is to crop or not to crop. There certainly is a school of thought, for example, Jared Pollan, Frono's photo, who's very anti-cropping, and I can understand why. His view is do your cropping in camera. That means getting forward if you want to get closer, standing back if you want a wider shot, get your line straight. And he's absolutely right. However, I take a much more liberal view, if you like. I want to make sure I capture the right image. And if I haven't, if my lines aren't straight, I'm absolutely going to use the cropping tool to straighten my image. And beyond that, I don't have a problem with these cameras shooting currently on a Nikon Z7, 54 megapixels. There's no problems in my view having a creative crop. Yes, you might have lost some data, and if I was going to blow it up to put on the wall behind me, maybe there'll be some issues, but 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100, that's not going to be a problem. So I'm going to give you an example of that in this next image. So this was from a series of photos, and this is unedited, I might add, a week or so ago, out on the beach. The first thing you'll notice about this image is that the horizon is not straight. Now I snapped this image walking back, trying to avoid waves, but there's no excuse, I didn't get it right. A school of thought would be that this is not a keeper and I should get rid of it, but how easy is it to come across into the cropping tool, and this is the straighten bar. 9 times out of 10, the auto button will work, which it has here, and you can make fine adjustments if need be. And you hit return, and there we go. I cannot tell you how important it is to have a straight horizon on your images, or straight lines, whether it's a building or a horizon, whatever it is. Nothing makes your image look more amateurish than having a horizon that isn't straight. So number 1, I have no problems with you doing that, and I think personally, I think you should. But we can go beyond that. So before we do that, I'm just going to give it a couple of quick edits here, just so it doesn't hurt my eyes while I'm editing. Now that image might be fine, but I might have taken 4 or 5 in a row, very similar images. Now you can edit them, all 5 of them, all the same, and have 5 pretty similar images. But how about using a creative crop? Remember that this is a 54 something megapixel image. The file size is like 90 megabytes with the Z7. Plenty of data there. What if we went trying to show the audience that this is a big, wide Queensland beach? What about if we create something a little more like this, and all of a sudden you've got an image which shows the wide open spaces, lengthy beach, the lack of people, and particularly because I'm shooting at 14 millimeters, that distortion at the edge of the images, which helps bring everyone into the center. As I said, this might not be the greatest panorama shot ever created, but it does help add to the story. So honestly, my tip is to get creative with that cropping tool if, and I guess these are the 2 ifs, big ifs, if number 1, your lines aren't straight, because your image will be ruined if it's not. And secondly, if it helps to tell the story, going back to original golden rule, what are you trying to say? Here, I'm trying to show the wide open spaces of Queensland beaches, and frankly, I think the creative panoramic crop helps. Okay, getting through the tips now, we're moving on to tip number 4, and that is the use of selective edits. If photography is painting with light, then using selective edits is like getting a fine paintbrush and just touching up little bits of your image that you may not have got right the first time. Now, being a travel photographer and a photojournalist, I very rarely get to use a flash or speed light. So I have to be a little more creative, or a little more thoughtful, if you like, how I get a perfectly exposed image, particularly if I'm shooting in broad daylight where I'm going to get either an overexposed background if I'm correctly exposing for a subject or vice versa. So selective edits can really help you solve that problem. Yeah, it's probably cheating a little, but I'm using the tools that I have at my disposal in Lightroom to recreate an image that I would maybe have created if I had a flash or a speedlight. But let me show you again in Lightroom exactly what I'm talking about. This is obviously a shot from the same day. We're well exposed in the background of the image, but our subject here is not particularly well exposed. So very quickly I'm going to show you how we can use selective edits to create the pretense that we might have a flash and certainly bring your eye to the subject of the image, which is fundamentally what we're trying to achieve. So let's just create one right here and very, very simply just bring the exposure up a little, not too much. You can be a lot finer with your adjustments, but just to show you what I'm talking about. And then we might use the brush to adjust the size here, down a little. But just by doing a little bit of this, and obviously bringing shadows helps as well. But just quite simply doing that, you'll have a look. And again, that's done very, very quickly. But from an image where, not a particularly good image, fundamentally, but it gives that impression that maybe we had a bit of light bouncing. But there's an example of using selective edits. I like to use it as a bit of a cheating tool in case I can't get my exposure balance between my background and my subject exactly how I want it. And I use this very, very regularly, whether it is I'm trying to focus the eye on a particular element of the image, or whether it is I've just made a complete error in my exposure. Using selective edits can be very, very powerful tool, so keep that one in mind. You don't have to do it all in once, all global edits with the light adjustments on the whole image. You can do it specifically for individual elements. So now, using the same image, I'm going to go to tip number 5, and that is using the heal tool. When you look at this image, and we've obviously been focused right here in the middle, and for good reason, because that's where my subjects are, a couple of things stand out to me. This tip is about making sure they stand out to you as well. And that is this arm sticking out right on the side of the image, as well as right here, we've got this crane. The heal tool is very powerful, but it has its limitations. But the point of this tip is to say, really have a good look at the four corners of your image and have a look if there are things that you think you can get rid of easily within Lightroom. I would probably, if I was editing this image and wanted to get rid of this crane, ultimately do it in Photoshop, which is significantly more powerful and more suited to that type of thing. But I'm going to show you how here, with the heal tool over here, how we might be able to do a quick edit with the heal tool to get by, to help you focus on the image and remove some distractions. So we're gonna go over here and adjust the size. And we're just gonna paint over this arm. And we're gonna see how Lightroom is gonna deal with this. And what you can do is tell Lightroom that's not the right area, and you can move this lower one around. It'll take a minute to catch up. And just by moving it around, you can play around and see what works best in painting over that particular image. So I've now removed the arm. Now, of course, the other thing I might do here is using our other tip is just a little crop. It would take a pretty trained eye to work out that I've deleted that arm there. Now you could do it significantly more precise if you had used a smaller heal tool. I used quite a large one, but you can see there that very, very quickly by using that heal tool, I've removed an object which was potentially distracting and going to take away from your image. For a quick edit on the fly, you have to get in pretty close to be able to work out that there was an arm over here and that there was something in the background right here. So my tip for you is to have a good look at your images and don't be afraid to use the heal tool but don't go overboard. Use it to remove distracting elements. There is a tendency to maybe want to remove every person from this beach. Personally, for those type of edits, which are of course possible, I would use Lightroom and spend my time with the content aware fill, and that would be, potentially half an hour or longer. My advice or my tip here is use the heal tool to remove elements of a photo which are distracting, because as I said, that is something which will set a professional photographer away from an amateur. So have a good look around, use the heal tool, very, very powerful. That's it, that's tip number 5, plus my golden rule. I hope you've got something out of this video. I hope you've enjoyed seeing me as I played with the sliders and let you see the process that I go through in a very abbreviated, quick way. But Lightroom is such an incredible tool. It's difficult to use, it's difficult to learn, but if you spend the time and you have a play with these particular 5 tips, I think you'll get there. Thanks for joining in. If you've got any comments, please let me know in the comments down below. I by no means the world's greatest expert at Lightroom, but these are the tips that help me get through. Give me a like or a dislike, and of course, remember to subscribe to my channel. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Photo Pro Traveller. Until next time.